So welcome everybody to the second webinar in our webinar series on democracy in Africa. I'm hoping that everybody attended the first one with Nick Cheeseman, which was about a month ago. This is the second of the webinar series, and there'll be more webinars at more or less once a month. These are actually organized by Matthias and Seshua, and we're really looking forward to the rest of this series. So today, Lisa Rachner and Maya Hinfala are going to be presenting a paper. This is a paper which they co-authored with Seshua and Nick van der Walle, and they'll have half an hour to present it, and then we'll turn to Bonnie Dulani, the discussant. I'm sure everybody knows who everybody is, but Lisa Rachner is at the University of Bergen, I think. And Maya Hinfala is at the Southern African SAIPA Institute for Policy and Research in Lusaka. And Bonnie Dulani is at the University of Malawi and Afrobarometer. He works also for the Afrobarometer Network. And I'm Jeremy Seekings. I'm at the University of Cape Town, and we can start. So thank you very much, Lisa and Maya. We're immensely pleased that you can present this paper. It's a very important paper, not just for people interested in Zambia, but for those of us who are interested in the entire region. We would know from history, as if we ignore what happens in one country, it's to our, I'm thinking of the Zimbabwean president. It's definitely to our detriment. The whole region needs to understand what's happening in individual countries. So over to first Lisa, and then I believe Maya will take over.
So thank you so much, Jeremy, and thanks for this kind introduction. So as Jeremy said, this presentation comes out of a paper that is called Weak Parties, Presidentialism and Legal Authoritarianism. And this is a paper that really captures the case of Zambia, and we think in particular since since 2015, but basically going back to the first PF election in 2011. The four authors, it sounds like quite a bit, so I should probably tell you that this is also one of the papers coming out of our research project that's been going on for 3 years. That's called Breaking Bad: Understanding Backlash Against Democracy in Africa. And Zambia is one of our 6 case studies. So back to what Jeremy said, it's not only important to understand what's going on in each and every country, if possible, but also to compare and try to compare across. So this is a paper coming out of that project. And Zambia is an interesting case for democracy, because Zambia is heralded as one of the great democratizer for political scientists. And why is that? Well, because through 5 parliamentary election cycle and actually 7 presidential, we've had twice a change of government from one party to the next, happening through elections. And it's also it's also a case where when a party loses that election, they actually leave. And it's a kind of a standard flag-bearing definition of democracy. Yet, Zambia is one of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa that has the most distinct trajectory of democratic backsliding, or sort of autocratization. It's maybe for us a more preferable term, because that also captures the countries that never really became democracies. So why is this happening in a country like Zambia? And as we will go into much more detail on the Zambia case when I give the word to Maria. But there are we're sort of looking at 2 very interesting interlinked mechanisms, we think, in the Zambian case. And that is the link between, you can just push forward, Maria, to so this is where. So it's basically 2 mechanisms that I want to talk about. The one is autocratic lawfare, and the second one is weak parties. So let's see how these work together. So in a country like Zambia, that sort of has, both internally in terms of interest groups and NGOs, but also internationally, a reputation and a veneer of a sort of a rule-based democracy. It's very costly to change the rules of the game and to go in an autocratic direction in terms of like more or less like coup-like mechanisms. So this, to use the law and to use established law, criminal law, and constitutional law, all kinds of everyday legal mechanisms to, in a sort of slow and piecemeal manner, chip away bits of democracy is actually very useful for a regime that kind of still wants to have a veneer of a rule of law state and a democracy. And so the backsliding that Maria will be talking about, and the realism, it is very much a form of what we call autocratic lawfare, or the use of law from criminal law to parliamentary law to constitutional law to actually chip away the rights of civil society, the rights of a free press, party and organizational rights. And so that's the one mechanism, the legal autocratization. We think that it's there are some reasons why this happens in a case like Zambia, because we're saying that regimes that have a poorly institutionalized party system and fluid party systems and weak parties are actually quite vulnerable to episodes of autocratization. And why is that? It's because these competitive elections and the fear and the risk of power alternations actually tend to reduce the time horizon for politicians. And it forces leaders to prioritize short-term tactical politics over long-term projects. In a system where the parties are weak, there are actually no internal sort of accountability mechanisms against presidential powers. The president holds pretty much all the power. The president and head of the party uses state resources to kind of buy off various party factions. And so the parties, despite their kind of, this being it's sort of a multi-party democracy where you do have parties changing over time, the parties are actually they are totally unable to sort of stop the force of presidential powers and to sort of become, function as a bulwark against a president wanting to move a system in an autocratic direction. So this link between weak parties and the use of the law or autocratic lawfare is the theoretical argument in which we try to explain these changes and this democratic backsliding in Zambia. So this is the first part of the paper, and we explain this in kind of 4 dimensions of backsliding or autocratization. And this is when I turn to Maria, and then you will explain these sort of four dimensions, or if you want to call it that. So thank you very much. Maria, floor is yours.
Thanks, Lisa. So here, well, it's basically, within the division, both Shishu and I have been kind of trying to trace those kind of processes where we feel that it's been chipped down over time. And so one of the elements we're looking at is the independent media. And of course, the independent media, as we all know, plays a crucial role in any society. We see that state ownership survived the one-party state in 1990. So we're still with the Times of Zambia, the Daily Mail. We still have the ZNBC television station. But we also got a really vibrant independent media in the 1990s. Some of them, the quality not very high, but we had quite a formidable force in the Post newspaper, which was led by Fred Member. And they were able to, over time, to quite criticize different governments. I mean, we can all remember when they called Manawasa the cabbage, and they were quite hard-hitting on presidents in power. So it has challenged successive governments, but was shut down eventually in June 2016. It followed a period where the Post was backing another faction within PF, not the Lungu faction, but the other one. So it created some enemies there. The legal mechanism here is that they used tax law to close it down. And while it was true that the Post newspaper had tax liabilities, we also know that most other newspapers also have the same, but they're not being shut down. There's like a, they can pay back over time. So there was a clear political motive in closing it down. So with the Post gone, it's really left a big void in Zambia. And that was then followed by the closure of prime television in 2020 by, and this title is a bit misleading, the Independent Broadcasting Authority. It's really government regulatory authority, which again, and the letter is posted to the site, is on quite a vague grounds, was closed down. They were promised to be able to reapply for a license, but they tried and they were never granted that. So that one is closed as well. So you find the media landscape in Zambia being quite limited in terms of what you can read on a day-to-day basis. So that is really limited, not only the media itself, but also it's very difficult for the opposition parties and the civil society to express. They don't have an outlet. Of course, you can see there's a rise of social media, but these kind of television and newspapers are really important. So that brings us to the undermining of civil society itself. I mean, they have less of a platform in terms of media outlet, but also they find it really difficult to demonstrate, to be activists. And of course, we know that activism was quite strong, especially it culminated in 2001 when opposition parties' activism came together to stop Chiluba's third term. It suffered a little bit after. It remained strong. It suffered from decline of donor funding, and there were other elements at play, but it continued to play a watchdog function. But we've seen in recent years that their activities have been really curtailed much more. So we see from 2011 kind of a cooptation. A lot of civil society co-opted in with the ruling party, so they defend what's happening, and so it's created a divided civil society. They don't speak one voice. The other thing is that you really see very little demonstrations going on, and if they do, people get arrested. So here we see a picture of Laura Miti demonstrating against corruption in front of Parliament, and while she gets arrested and prosecuted, most cases are dropped. It's not like someone is in prison still. But going through that process, it gives a signal to other civil society that this can happen when you start to demonstrate, but also the cost of demonstration is really high, because if you're constantly prosecuted, you have to get lawyers engaged, and it's very costly in Zambia to do so. So you can see that through those mechanisms of applying the Public Order Act, which is an old act, but it's been really used more intensely in recent years. It's been able to curtail the powers of non-state actors. Of course, if we talk about COVID, that's a whole bunch of new legislation, which again is being used to stop meetings and demonstrations by civil society. So we've also seen in the same manner the weakening of opposition political parties, and they've done that through three different mechanisms, legal mechanisms. So you have the Societies Act, which regulates the registration of the associations. This was under the Ministry of Home Affairs. And we saw the deregistration either temporary or permanently of several parties, including MMD, the Democratic Party, and the National Democratic, the NDC of Cambrile. So again, the certainty of being registered as a political party has been undermined. We also see the use or abuse of the penal code, and we saw that very clearly in 2017. This was in the case where Hichilema Hakainda, better known as HH, overtook a convoy in which President Lungu was riding, and instead of saying this is like a traffic offense or anything else, they charged him with treason charges, which led him to be imprisoned together with the other people HH was with. In total, he spent 4 months in prison. So this was in a period where, there was still the kind of leftover, the satisfaction with the 2016 elections. So it was a mechanism of taking the opposition party out of the picture. Eventually, the state dropped the case against him, and then he was released. But of course, damage was done because we could see, leaders had become quite afraid of stepping out. Another way, also in opposition parties, Public Order Act is employed, same like civil society. So it's been very difficult for opposition parties to campaign. And if we remember, PF, was really successful in attracting a following when it was in opposition itself by having massive campaigns throughout the country. That has become really difficult to pull off, both by enacting the Public Order Act and of course now with the new COVID regulations, we see that also being more and more limited. So one way of using the Public Order Act is like if President Lungu is campaigning somewhere, the opposition is not allowed to campaign. So what happens is UPND, the opposition party, would organize a campaign somewhere, and the ruling party would make sure to organize something at the same time so that they can say, under Public Order Act, you're not allowed to be here. So it's been really difficult for the opposition parties to touch base. And so there's an accusation of opposition, being more active on social media rather than on the ground. But, it is a very difficult moment for political parties to be on the ground at the moment. We have to see how it plays out in the next 3 months in the run-up to the elections, where on paper they should have more space to go out, but it's going to be quite restricted as we can see it. We see some level of resilience. That was in Bill number 10. Bill number 10, we had a new constitution in 2016. An amendment of the constitution, but it left us with quite a few gaps. And so the idea was to amend it. And there were some good reasons to amend our constitution, but it was very much used politically to strengthen the executive at the expense of the legislature and the judiciary. And that really, this was all going on last year and earlier this year. And you could see a little bit of a momentum of opposition parties together with civil society to say, like, we don't want this kind of draconian law being put forward, because that would have really threatened democracy even further. Because the bill needed 2/3 in parliament and the ruling party doesn't have 2/3, and opposition managed to hold strong despite attempts to undermine or to buy off some of the MPs, the bill then failed to pass. But what we have seen since then, Parliament closed about a week ago, but before that, in about 2 months' time, we had a flurry of laws, which again, are really kind of tools of autocratic lawfare. Some of them are like the Cybersecurity and Cybercrimes Act, the Data Protection Act, the Legal Aid Act, there's an Electoral Amendment Act. And again, there's some positive elements into it, but also some very draconian sections within those acts. So this is where we are at the moment. Maybe Lisa, you can say some concluding remarks.
I cannot
Lisa,
believe, I cannot believe I still do this. Like 14 months into COVID and Zoom. Anyway, so let me just try to sort of summarize what Maria has said. I think one of the things that we really wanted to carry out through, you know, the discussion that Maria just led us through is to see how, in a sense, it's sort of a lot of the time it's kind of, it's more or less pedestrian law that's being used. You know, it's tax law, it's an old colonial law, the Public Order Act. It's sort of like sleeping laws coming back to play. And we've seen, you know, we see that in a lot of mechanisms, for instance, linked to sexual and reproductive rights and so forth, that we don't really touch in this paper, what we talk about in other papers. And then, of course, you know, the new constitution, and, you know, there is this sort of back and forth. Yes, there are some positive elements, but on the other hand, you know, it's going in a certain direction. What this case shows is that it's actually very difficult because it's piecemeal and it happens on so many fronts. And you know, as you just mentioned, Maria, there are few people in civil society being imprisoned or in prison at the time, but there's just, you know, the kind of knowing what's going to happen to you, the legal repercussions that you are facing. It's really kind of a scare mechanism, and it functions quite well. And so, like we said here, this happens in what we thought of as a relatively, you know, in theory, quite sort of institutionalized multi-party system. But because of the use of the law, and with the weak sort of party structures and few internal mechanisms holding back in terms of presidential powers, you know, we are very quickly ending up in a very distinct situation of democratic backsliding. I think I'm just going to stop there. There is a paper that Boniface, there are many versions of the paper. Sishua, our dear friend, who is really taking the brunt of this fight against backsliding, is working on an update of this paper. And so we're super happy to share the paper with all of you and to have comments. But for now, just really grateful that you are here and looking forward to all your comments. And thank you, Maria, for taking us through the empirical part.
Thank you very much, Maya and Lisa. That's great. So Bonnie is our discussant. So Bonnie, over to you.
Thank you.
You are unmuted.
Thank you, Jeremy. The two presenters really have stuck it to time, so I'll do my best really to be shorter than the presenters, because otherwise it would create a very bad impression of myself. Let me say that I did enjoy reading the paper, the draft version of the paper. As a Malawian, of course, Zambia is very close to my heart. I spent quite a bit of months, I think way back in 2008, I believe, you know, doing some research in Zambia. So I've always kept abreast of political developments in Zambia. Of course, as a Malawian myself, I also needed to follow events, political events in Zambia. As is sure, one of the authors reminded us in a tweet recently, political developments in Malawi and Zambia tend to mirror each other. So I worry when I read about the democratic backsliding in Zambia that that could be a precursor for you know, democratic backsliding in Malawi as well in the near future. I hope it's the other way around, and that we can also give, I think, our Zambian colleagues some encouragement that things can actually turn for the better. You know, so reading, I think, about this, you know, this paper and the political developments in Zambia through the paper, I couldn't help but think back, I think, to that research that I was doing on the presidential term limits and the attempts to seek a third term for the late President Chiluba in Zambia. You know, in 2008, I was so impressed by the the strength and the vibrancy of civil society in Zambia. And I see there was this forum, gets a shout out in the paper, did play quite a key role in challenging, I think, the attempts to remove the presidential term limits clause. Indeed, I was so impressed that in part of my discussion, then I actually made the argument that, look, I mean, if the third term bid in Zambia had even passed through parliament, which was going to be a challenge given the pressure from civil society and the wider public, it's still unlikely that it could have gone through, I think, a referendum, because the Zambians really looked like they were very keen and ready to defend their democratic freedoms. I think, on the other hand, in Malawi at the time, our fear was if the attempt to remove the term limit clause had gone through parliament, most likely the Malawian public would have voted in favor of removing it in a referendum. So it worries me to see that this vibrancy of civil society in particular, including an independent media and a vibrant opposition, is slowly and surely being emaciated, I think, by the current regime in Zambia. And the paper has done, I think, quite a great job in giving us detailed examples of cases where the government has used the law to stifle the opposition, to stifle, even eliminate the independent media and independent voices, including stifling civil society organizations. That said, I just have a couple of questions that I would like you to pose to Lisa and Malia, and indeed the authors of the paper. To what extent does, I think, really agency matter? And in this case, I'm really thinking of the person of President Lungu himself. I pose this question because the examples of the laws that the government has been using, the Public Order Act, or the Party Registration Act, most of these have been there since 1991, even indeed before that period. And yet we see, only this period, especially, yes, as you point out, 2011, I think, when the PF gets into power, but more importantly, I think after 2015, when President Lungu, I think, ascends to the presidency. So what does this really tell us about the person of President Lungu himself? And I think that story might actually be the main threat to democracy and democratization in Africa, that, we get some of these kind of leaders that are elected that are popularly elected, but then they quickly turn against the very same institutions that propelled them to power, to further strengthen their hold on power and undermine any opposition to their leadership. And so asking perhaps, the question, to what extent has the Zambian opposition itself played into the hands of the government? You give that example of MMD, for instance, and how they were deregistered because they had not paid their annual membership dues for such a long period of time, at least from 1993. And clearly, I think, this is a law that was enacted under the MMD, the MMD government way back in the early 1990s, and they themselves, ignore that law, and then it is used against them. Now you wonder that if they had been on top of paying their membership dues, what would the PF government have done? You would have at least eliminated this excuse, or at least the government would have had to find a different excuse to register them. And I think the same, applies, to the example of the Post newspaper. I was a big fan of the Post newspaper, I should say, and I do miss it to this very day. One of the things that I used to do every day, in the 2000s, early 2000s, was just to make sure that at least I didn't miss the Post newspaper online, and I miss those days. But again, you also look at the history and I think how the post perhaps, became too cozy with the political opposition, especially PF from, its founding in 2001. And then, of course, for a time, they were allies until PF, I think, came into power, and then they saw no more need for the Post newspaper. And then the Post also puts itself in this kind of position where they don't, pay their taxes, and then the government pounces on that and closes them down. We've had similar cases, I think, even in our own country here in Malawi, where government has used the tax authorities to try and shut down opposition media, and especially critical media. And on one hand, I think we all know what is going on, and that the reason is they wanted to silence critical voices. But at the same time, there are these opportunities that are provided to government, and then the government really pounces on that. I also, I think, Maria, you touched on, I think, how the government has used COVID-19 to suppress political and democratic rights. Again, perhaps I've been reading an earlier version of the draft, because if there was one thing that I was really looking for in the paper, was, I think, more discussion on how COVID-19 has been used really, again, as an opportunity to silence opposition. We know, I think, in Uganda, the government there used COVID-19 to basically, limit opportunities for the opposition to campaign effectively. In Tanzania, I think it was a similar situation. Even here in Malawi last year, when we had our fresh presidential elections, there was also a similar attempt to use the COVID-19, but I think that was, blatantly, it was just ignored by the opposition and the wider public. I'd like you to learn more, in other words, from the Zambia case, how government has tried to use COVID-19 really to suppress the opposition. Lastly, and I have a couple more, a lot of more points that I could share, but maybe for the current, purposes. Lastly, I think the issue of the constitutional amendment bill of 2019 that you also, Maria, you alluded to. I think the paper maybe doesn't do as much justice, or at least the current version, in explaining how and what kind of amendments were included in that ill-fated proposal, and how they were going to again further suppress, I think, democracy in Zambia. So I read about it and I thought, okay, most likely, I think, given how it was rushed, but I just didn't get, I think, enough meat in the discussion to understand what exactly, I think, the amendments we are trying to achieve. So let me not speak it too much and hog the time. But thank you once again for highlighting, I think, these challenges. I know with some colleagues we've been talking about coming up with an index of democratic capture in Africa, and I think this paper does quite add a lot, I think, to this discussion in terms of what is happening on the continent. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bonnie. Those are great comments. Before we allow Maya or Lisa to reply, I see there's at least one question from the audience. Let's take a couple of questions from the audience. I've got Monty McMurky and then Michael Warman. Monty, would you like to unmute yourself?
Good day. Monty McMurky calling at this point from my basement bunker in downtown Toronto. However, my life is in DR Congo, where I spend time in governance recalibration along and teaching a course in Les Droits Administratifs Publics. My comment to this most excellent conversation, I'm thinking of Gene Sharp's book, From Dictatorship to Democracy, and also Erica Chenoweth in terms of why civil resistance works, which is in a sense a reverse from what you are suggesting in your paper, which I have not as yet read. But my question is this, that the states or the political elites are extremely reluctant to give up power privilege, and I underline the word privilege, and they will tend to do almost anything within what I call the scion or the veil of jurisprudence, highly Potemkin. And the query is, and this was witnessed in Uganda with Bobby Wine, when there is a disciplined group of people nonviolent, because nonviolence is the way, that is the puissance, the strength, the power, and the state tends to come down hard. How can this best be ameliorated in terms of what I call positive prescriptive pushback in terms of holding the governing elites to account, in terms of making them understand the implied civic, civil, social contract that serving in government is a service, not a means of aggregating personal gain? I thank you.
One more, if you can keep a list, Maya and Lisa. Michael Warman.
Right. Well, thanks, all three of you. I knew that this would be good given the lineup, so I wasn't disappointed at all. When I hear your conversations, and also in reaction to some of Boniface's excellent comments, you know, it seems like Zambia is interesting because you can think about both long-term trends and short-term trends. And the interesting thing with Zambia is that even though the level of democracy seems to have varied within a specific range, I think most of us would agree that Zambia has never been a liberal democracy. It has also not since 1991 been a closed autocracy. So there's been some sort of range between some sort of electoral autocracy to some sort of electoral democracy, where Zambia has varied. But within that range, there has been quite a bit of variation in that time span. So some of the issues that you point to, particularly institutional explanations to this level of democratic backsliding, seem to me very reasonable, but maybe those have been more kind of long-term explanations for why Zambia has not progressed more. So if you think about things like the constitution, which has been fairly constant, although there has been some amendments to it, but particularly the level of presidentialism or party institutionalization, it seems like these have been quite constant. But something that you don't really address is short-term economic development. And I wonder if this could be potentially an alternative explanation, rather than saying that this is an actor-oriented story, looking particularly at President Lungu. So we've had a situation where we've had a rapidly declining economy for the last 10 years in Zambia, after a fairly successful period. And this seems like this has been very closely, tied to the popularity of the government's ability to win elections using legitimate means. And it seems quite reasonable that this autocratization is a response to declining popularity due to a suffering economy.
Maya, Lisa, who wants to go first?
I can give a start with the more response to the empirical material, perhaps. To what extent does external agency matters, Bonnie? I think it ties in a little bit with what Michael is saying just now. Under what circumstances does the scenario change, where some of the institutions maybe remain the same or the same rules remain? I think if we talk about ingrained presidentialism in Zambia, we just didn't have a leader who who abused it to the extent that we see happening now. So there is personal agency. I would agree with Bonnie that it happens in certain circumstances, like an economic decline, where political survival becomes more stark, perhaps. But at the same time, you know, PF was, you know, they were still, the economy was doing quite well, even up to 2016. If you look at Afrobarometer data and see how people were looking at the economy and how they were still positive about it, you know, that's up to 2017. There was not such a negative feeling. The negative feeling is really quite recently. So yes, it's a factor, but not the whole story. I think in the Backlash Against Democracy project, we also look at what's the influence of changing donor influence. You know, in the 90s, we had a strong donor influence. Even in the 2000s, still we had the conditionalities of IMF and the HIPC, the debt, and that really disciplined the government. They were really more rule-bound in that period of time. And that's no longer the case after 2006, I would say. The opposition, does it play into the hands? Yeah, I mean, you know, I think the Post, even when it was closed, it didn't get much public sympathy because of, you know, it being too close to business interest. People also said, well, you're not paying your taxes, then you make yourself vulnerable. I think it was very much one of the reactions. But I think, you know, it was just a first sign of how they were going to tackle media, and the Post was a big example, but we have a lot of more media outfits who are affected by that. And those didn't bend the rules. I mean, they were registered, they did pay their taxes. So we see like a slippery slope there, which I think is a trend which is dangerous. I do think that civil society has learned from it. You know, if you talk to successful civil society activists, they also say that, you know, you have to be very clean, because you know they're going to look into your tax, they're going to look in your, you know, if you're sticking to labor laws, if you're having an affair or not, you know. So there's a learning process where civil society opposition parties learn how to deal with those circumstances and realize that they have to be squeaky clean, you know, to avoid the harassment from that side. But then they're still being attacked by other means. So it's still the selectivity of that mechanism, which I think is an important one. COVID-19, we've done 3 blogs on the impact of COVID on Zambia. I shared a link on the site if people are interested in reading that. It's not completely up to date. Shishua is doing a research on the impact of COVID on the current elections, and so are 2 people at the University of Zambia. So it'll be important to follow. But just to say that the Electoral Commission of Zambia has just said that they won't allow any campaigns because of the COVID situation. We're just going to see if that applies for all, or it's going to be selective. Yeah, that's the big question now. The amendment bill, yeah, I mean, the restrictions out of the amendment bill, I mean, there's so many, but I think an important one was that the president was able to create any constituency, and there was no limit to it. So that would have changed the electoral landscape completely. Yeah, so that was like a really massive amendment, which was a very dangerous one. And then there were some clauses which were really entrenching executive power and taking away even autonomy, like from the Central Bank of Zambia, those kind of clauses to really take away more and more powers from the institutions. But there's some good articles about it. Why civil resistance works, the example of non-violent and Bobby Wine. Yeah, I think, you know, I think what we're hoping to see now is that people feel more safe in numbers. You know, that elections are coming up. There's a little bit of space for people to come together. And I think everybody's very aware that, you know, non-violence is the way to go, because people are afraid of the police, whatever, so they would want to create an atmosphere. We don't know what happens, you know, when the election results come out, because then you're going to have those kind of tensions. But I think for now, the opposition and civil society have been quite calm, and I think there's been a little bit more cooperation than before. Lisa?
So thank you, Marja, and thank you, Bonnie, and thank you for great questions, great comments, and super helpful in, for the, our sort of second drafting of the paper. So just a lot of really good comments, I have to say, and I agree with everything. I think, for instance, in this COVID and the government's treatment of COVID-19 in the election will, we'll need to come into this to this article as well, and I totally agree that there's more work to do on the constitutional amendment bill. So that's in the works. But I was thinking that I would try to make a general comment that sort of fits Monty's and Michael's and Bonnie's comments kind of combined, because I think one of the things that we probably should state, should sort of underline is, while Zambia has been heralded as this sort of multi-party democracy and even sort of reaching going somewhere towards consolidation of democracy, one of the striking thing about Zambia is the limited amount and the limited sort of depth of institutional change that actually took place in 1991. So for instance, the constitution wasn't really amended. So, there were some small amendments to an autocratic constitution. And there's been like 7 or 8 or 9 and God knows so many constitutional amendment clauses. But we're still working with a very limited Bill of Rights and a very limited constitution with a lot of leftover powers from the days of one-party rule. The same, which is really fascinating. I think Zambia almost has a world record in government parties falling apart as soon as they leave government. So, which is really a very strong sign of excessively weak parties. UNIP survived a couple of years after it lost the election in 1991. MMD survived, what is it, like 3 weeks? Something like that. And so, it's actually really striking how 20 years in power, you still don't build party institutions. And so I think, going back to your point, Bonnie, yes, this is a situation that's ripe for an autocratic leader who maybe, as Michael said, by sheer necessity, because of the economic crises, needs, takes power in his hands because that is the way to survive. And as I think it was Monty said, people stay in government for the privileges. Nobody wants to leave if they don't have to. So what we need from people to, strong parties and institutionalized parties become very important, because then you have a real internal competition for the privileges. And but in a situation where these are gone or these are weak, that means strong, individuals can actually change politics quite significantly. And I think I want to sort of tie my comment. Well, I very much agree, Bonnie. I think I still want to tie my comment to what Michael said. It is really about the weakness of institutions. It's not really so much agency as agency being allowed because of the weakness of institution. So I just think it's, and just one more comment, because this is our, I don't want to, I hate to advertise, but this is the thing that Marja and I and this and Breaking Bad project has been working really hard on, is to try to sort of look at the interlinkages between the international mechanisms of the international environment and the sort of institutional legal mechanisms. And it is clear that the fact that Zambia meeting this sort of medium income country in the early 2000s tremendously changed dynamics on the ground. From a donor country with all the kind of routinization of governance aid and, the sort of kind of institution building of civil society, that was all gone. And so, and it created a very, very new environment that also exposed the weakness of civil society. So I think, you know, we're not really pushing that angle in this paper, but that's coming in. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Somebody's talking. I should stop.
Hello. This conversation is continuing. Lisa, I'm going to abuse my position and push back a bit at you on this and at Maya. So your concept of backsliding is very useful because the threat to democracy is no longer simply that the military come in, execute a coup, deploy their massive power, suspend the constitution. You're pointing to the kind of, in a sense, the erosion of democracy incrementally through legislative changes and the gradual increase of executive power, the decline of accountability, etc. Right? But the problem with the backsliding is, how do we know how far the backsliding has gone? I mean, we know when there's a coup because the military take over the radio station and suspend the constitution. With backsliding, because it's incremental, it's quite difficult to assess whether the glass is a quarter full or 3/4 full or 1/2 full or whatever, right? So here's my pushback. So take the media. I mean, Maya talked about the controls of the media, shutting down the Post, shutting down independent TV stations. But we know from survey data that everybody in Zambia knows the economy is a mess. Everybody in Zambia knows that the government is responsible, or thinks the government is responsible for it. Everybody knows that the government is corrupt, right? There's none of the things which are a really big deal are a secret. Everybody knows them anyway, probably not least because of their experience or because of social media. So the fact that the media, the formal media are controlled doesn't mean that Zambians are ignorant about the most important issues facing the country, right? And secondly, you talk about party weakness. And I look at the Zambian case and I'm thinking, well, actually, you know, the parties, especially the UPND, are actually very strong. And, you know, Lungu's strategy is much more a reflection of his weakness rather than, in fact, the weakness of the UPND. I mean, the UPND, you know, it's shown the kind of resilience that obviously UNIP and MMD did not show once they were defeated. You know, its leader gets locked up, it loses elections, or, you know, elections are stolen, right? But it's still there. It actually has suffered very, very few defections. You know, it's pretty much holding itself together. You know, and all of the evidence suggests that if there were free and fair elections, it would probably defeat the governing party. So I look at that and think this is not a question of party weakness. This is actually an issue of party strength, and that the backsliding is precisely because you have a would-be autocrat who wants to abuse his position of power, right, in order to stay in power when the opposition is actually pretty powerful. Over to you. You're muted, Lisa. You're muted.
Maya, do you want to go first, and then I'll tackle the party thing?
Yeah, no, I mean, Jeremy, you're right. I mean, how far has backsliding gone? You know, I mean, having lived here for 30 years, I think you get a sense of it, what you can do and can't do, the space that you have, even as an academic here. And like you said, what people know on the ground, but, you know, let's say the economy would have been fine, you know, you would have, you know, they would have still wanted to stay in power. So I think it's still important to have civil society and media functioning, because, you know, by the time people start feeling the brunt of it, I mean, we're really too late, you know, so much damage has been done, and you don't really want to go to that extent. And you know, if we've had you know, pushback against the high levels of corruption, I mean that's a very important task of civil society, and doesn't come, you know, it's the whole idea of that you have democracy in between elections. You know, how do you hold people accountability so that you don't have this mess you end up in? I mean, I agree that UPND is very strong and true. I mean, it's probably one reason. I mean, UPND, for those who might not know it, has been in existence for 20 years under difficult circumstances, and is doing well. So of course that Lungu, or the ruling party, is reacting against that. But I think there's more going on than just that. Yeah. You say if they're free and fair elections, I think that's the whole problem now. I mean, how can we have free and fair elections? The premises are not there. People have little faith in the Electoral Commission of Zambia. People have no faith in judiciary. People are afraid of the police. So, you know, we've gone to such a stage that our elections look very different, and Afrobarometer data shows very clearly that people not even dare to speak out who are they favoring, which is very unusual in a Zambian context. So it has had an effect that it's more difficult to do research because people don't want to speak. They will vote maybe freely, but you don't have the same kind of freedom of conversation that we used to have.
So thank you very much, Maria. These are great comments and a great conversation. And it's not clear cut, because I mean, I also agree. And if, you know, if this was a seminar on opposition parties, I would, you know, looking at sort of across sub-Saharan Africa, Zambia will be one of the countries that would stand out with an opposition party who's actually survived, you know, as a party without winning an election for this whole time period, which is in and of itself quite significant. So in a sense, so I think that's a caveat that we need to address this, that there is a kind of a UPND is an example of a relatively institutionalized, opposition party, and the strength is its kind of spatial and regional kind of security, that it has, you know, it has some almost guaranteed basis, sort of kind of spatial basis in a sense, and that you can expand from in terms of coalition building and so forth. What I'm particularly referring to, or we are in this paper, is how being in government has not induced a UNIP, MMD, or PF to actually build a party organization. And what is it that has really kind of hindered these parties in terms of building an organization while in power with the resources that they have? And this is what's coming back, in a sense, to bite, because there are no bulwark, there are no sort of protection mechanisms against a person like Lungu, who's now quite desperate to maintain power. So I think there's a, you know, so it's more about the parties in power not using that, even, you know, not even time or reason to actually build. I think that's the main focus of the paper. And it's also back to Maria's presentation. It's and I think it was somebody else, maybe it was Monty or Michael, who said, you know, how PF co-opted civil society in 2011. You know, how, you know, the Post, you know, the opposition parties, the opposition press, everyone kind of went with PF. And that became a huge, those years after 2011 was a huge weakness and, you know, a big threat to the overall democracy of Zambia. So I think, we could talk forever.
So I think this is getting very interesting. So I think we should push you a bit further on this. I don't see any other hands up, so I'm going to abuse my position. So the thesis that's emerging, and I can't remember if it's in the paper, is really that that this backsliding is really a function of governing party weakness, right? And this is presumably important because if you have a strong governing party and you're confident that you could survive an election defeat, you'll be more confident that you could contest a future election and get back into office at some point in the future, right? But if you think that your party is going to go the same way as UNIP and the MMD, then you don't want to give up power because you'll never get it back, right? So it's the anticipation of disintegration and mass defections from the PF, which is really important here, right? So, and that's a pretty good thesis, right? Now, I mean, it does raise the question as to, you know, is there something, why does the UPND manage to hold itself together despite a string of defeats? And the PF thinks it cannot hold itself together at its first defeat. Right? If that is the case, is this a function of, you know, of governing parties generally? Is this a function of particularly of populist parties? I'm thinking of sort of Sata populism as Sishua and more recently Hangala have written about, or is this a sort of a function of the particular palace politics within the PF that led to Lungu, who, you know, has got no clear ideological character or programmatic appeal or even organizational support taking power? I mean, is this takes us back to, I think, Bonnie's question. Is this a product of institutions that incentivize presidents to use executive power rather than maintain party cohesion? Is it a function of the particular kind of party that the PF was, or is this a function of Lungu's own particular limited appeal and power base? That's a question for both of you.
Do you want me to go first, Maya? Or do you want Maya always reminds me that she's the historian. She can give you all the detail and all the numbers and all the things. But, you know, when it comes to these, you know, the theories of the parties, she wants to stay. So I'll go first. I think these are great questions and great issues to reflect around, because I think it's not really just PF, because it was also MMD and it was UNIP beforehand. So it is something about the party in government in a highly and excessive presidential system. And, you know, the combination of this excessive presidentialism and very competitive elections, because elections in Zambia, apart from that period until you know, there were like a few years that it was, you know, where MMD had majority power, but apart from that, elections have been excessively, you know, and competitive, and also you know, the majority in parliament has not been great unless it's been sort of kind of manipulated, you know, when you buy off your opposition. And so I think it's this combination of competitive party system and weak majorities and presidentialism that kind of drives the sort of disincentive for parties in government to institutionalize. So, you know, the question is, would this happen to UPND? That would be quite interesting to see. But okay, so that's a question for the future. But maybe it's something about being, you know, maybe it's just a lot easier to not be in government, in a sense, in terms of building this. And maybe we don't really know. Maybe we don't really. Well, actually, we should get back to Nicole here on this party institutionalization of UNIP. So, I mean, because we do know quite a bit about that, actually. Maya, you want to help me out?
I mean, you know, there was a period when I think one sign of party weakness is how do you handle succession within the party? And that's always been badly handled in Zambia. So succession, presidential succession, and of course we had 2 presidents dying in office, and that created a lot of problems because we didn't have this kind of succession plan. But even within UPND, you saw it when Mazoka died, the first leader of UPND. You know, UPND sank quite a bit. I mean, it almost won the 2001 election, and it went down to being quite a small party when PF came up. So you can see the same is going to be for UPND. If there's going to be, if HH needs to be replaced, we can see the viability of the party? And I think that's quite a crucial question, which they are themselves are aware of. Yeah.
I just want to acknowledge Michael's point in the commentary. I think that's an excellent point.
So if you haven't seen Michael's comments in the chat, maybe Bonnie might say something about this in a moment. Michael suggesting that the UPND strength and its endurance, its resilience, reminds him of the Malawi Congress Party, which was exemplarily resilient over a long period of time. And perhaps that's because they are both rooted in economically powerful parts of the country. And we might sort of add benefit from both economic foundations and a degree of ethnic solidarity. I've got a hand up from Nicole, and then I think we should just, we're going to need to wrap up. So Nicole, please.
Hi. Oh, sorry, my Zoom required me to give some permissions. I think it's been a really fascinating conversation. And as a scholar of the UPND, I'm quite interested in this question of how strong the party is or how weak the party is. And I think the discussion around what party institutionalization means in a context like Zambia is absolutely crucial. Because for me, it seems that the UPND is not necessarily a strong or an institutionalized party, but the most effective vehicle for capturing an anti-incumbent vote. And I think that has become increasingly important as we've seen the PF's support drop. So to me, it almost seems, I could envision a time when the UPND shrinks to being a less nationally important party again, because a more viable vehicle becomes available. And so I would just be interested for like any brief reflections on that from you, Jeremy, or from Maya. Thanks.
I think we need to go back. We'll allow the presenters and Bonnie. Bonnie, do you want to come back in at this point?
Yeah, thank you. Again, very interesting discussion. I think I think the point about whether Lungu is essentially using this as a strategy to paper over his own weaknesses within PF and perhaps as a leader, and how then his leader tended to using the law kind of opportunistically, if I may say so, to suppress any challenges to his rule. I think one question that is still rings in my mind is the situation in Zambia. I mean, with the all these colonial era laws and like the Public Order Acts and the like. They are also available in other countries. And why is it that they are being used at this particular moment in time? And I think we need to interrogate that a little bit more. But otherwise, I think I liked, also the broadening of the discussion beyond Zambia and bringing in these other cross-country comparisons and how similar, I think, events are also occurring in other countries. So Michael's point about MCP and UPND is quite relevant. Although I would have to say that the MCP in Malawi is not as well resourced, even though it comes from a region that it traditionally has, is well endowed in resources. But as the party, it might not be, I think, as well resourced as, say, UPND has been. But I guess having been in government for so long during the authoritarian era is also something really to think about. And of course, I would say that the best comparison for MCP would actually have to be UNIP in Zambia. But as we know, UNIP is long gone. And I think that's a question that actually it is sure and other colleagues we are also looking into to say, why is it that UNIP disappeared the way of the dodo, whereas MCP in Malawi is still surviving? But an excellent paper and excellent comments. Thank you.
Lisa Maya. Final thoughts.
So I'm just going to say thank you, and then I'll leave the last word to Maria. But I also want to just like signpost that Bonnie is writing a paper about this. So I think that's coming at APSA, isn't it? So just to stay tuned for the comparison between Zambia and Malawi. I'm really looking forward to that. And thank you all for great comments and a fantastic conversation. So Maria, last word is yours.
No, last words. I think, I think at the moment, maybe a side effect of what's happening in Zambia is that there's more attention in Zambia, so also more work. And so I think in the next few months and years, we're going to see more research on Zambia, hopefully indeed more comparative as well. But yeah, we're quite active around the coming elections, and who knows, we have a different conversation after the next elections, because then so many things are going to be proven or disproven. And it's a very fluid situation, in my opinion. Yeah, but yeah, thanks very much for all the good questions, and it's given me quite some things to think about. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much to Lisa Maya for a wonderful presentation and conversation. And thank you, Bonnie, for your comments as discussant. I think it's really important that when we are trying to understand political developments in any one country, that we always try and locate it in a sort of comparative gaze, comparative context. That's very important. One of the problems with historians, Maya, is that they're too much focused on the past, of course, and are more cautious about thinking about the future. Obviously, what happens in the elections is going to reshape how we think about the pre-election period. I think that all of us social scientists should all be forced to predict things and motivate for our predictions in advance of elections, so that we can't just rework our analyses with the benefit of hindsight the whole time. So great, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to Sashua and Matthias Kunke for organizing this webinar, and to Lamise for the logistical backup. If you are not on our mailing list, please email us and at IDCPPA@UCT/ACZA, and we'll let you know when the next webinar is. Thank you very much, everybody. Great.